On December 4, 1991, a Pan Am Boeing 727 touched down at Miami International Airport. The pilots shut down the engines. And then they sat there, in silence, because they had nowhere to go. That flight, Pan Am Flight 436 from Bridgetown, Barbados, was the last revenue flight in the history of Pan American World Airways. The last paying passengers, the last crew, the last time that famous blue globe on the tail of a Pan Am aircraft meant anything at all. His name was Juan Trippe. And if you wanted to design a character specifically to represent a certain kind of American ambition, the kind that looks at the impossible and treats it as a scheduling problem, you could not do better than Juan Trippe. He was born in 1899 in Seabright, New Jersey, into a family of comfortable means. His father was a banker. His mother came from old money. He grew up with the kind of quiet confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from never having been told that the things he wanted were beyond his reach. He went to Yale. He was not a scholar. He was a socializer, a connector, a young man who understood instinctively that the relationships you build in your 20s are the infrastructure of your 30s and 40s. He flew for the Navy in the First World War, or more precisely, he trained to fly for the Navy, and the war ended before he saw combat. But the training gave him something more valuable than combat experience. It gave him the sky. He felt at home up there in a way he never quite felt on the ground. The clarity of it, the scale of it, the sense that from altitude, the distances that seemed impossible at ground level shrank to something manageable, something crossable. After Yale, Trippe tried banking. He tried the family business. He was terrible at it and knew it immediately. What he wanted was aviation. What he saw, with the particular clarity of a 25-year-old who has not yet been told what is realistic, was that commercial aviation was going to transform the world, and that the person who figured out how to make it work financially would transform themselves along with it. In 1927, the same year Charles Lindbergh flew solo across the Atlantic and made the entire world suddenly believe that aviation was real, Juan Trippe founded Pan American Airways. His initial route was a mail contract between Key West, Florida, and Havana, Cuba. 90 miles over open water. Nothing glamorous. Nothing historic. Except that it was, because what Trippe understood, what made him different from every other aviation entrepreneur of his era, was that mail contracts were not the business. Mail contracts were the financing mechanism for the business. The business was passengers. The business was connecting human beings to places they had never been able to go before, at speeds they had never been able to travel before. In comfort that turned a journey from an ordeal into an experience, the mail contract to Havana gave Pan Am revenue. The revenue allowed Trippe to buy better aircraft. Better aircraft allowed him to bid on longer routes. Longer routes generated more revenue. More revenue bought more aircraft. Trippe understood this compounding logic before almost anyone else in the industry. He played it with the patience and the precision of a chess grandmother, always thinking 3 moves ahead. Always positioning Pan Am for the route that didn't yet exist, but that he could see coming. By 1930, Pan Am had routes throughout the Caribbean and Central America. By 1935, through a combination of audacity, negotiation, and the sheer force of Trippe's personality, Pan Am had crossed the Pacific. Not the short hop across the Pacific. The entire Pacific. San Francisco to Manila. Across the largest ocean on Earth, in a flying boat called the China Clipper, operated by a crew who understood that they were doing something that had never been done before, and felt the full weight of that knowledge. With every hour of flight, the China Clipper flight of November 22, 1935, covered 8,000 miles in 59 hours and 48 minutes. It carried mail, not passengers. The route wasn't certified for passengers yet, but the crowd that gathered at Alameda, California to watch it depart was enormous. 25,000 people, standing on the shore of San Francisco Bay, watching a flying boat lift off the water and head west toward a horizon that had always been the edge of the reachable world. They stood there because they understood, in the way that crowds sometimes understand things before the newspapers can explain them, that they were watching history happen in real time. The Atlantic crossing came in 1939. The Yankee Clipper flew from Port Washington, New York to Lisbon, Portugal to Marseille, France. 22 passengers. each one paying what was then an extraordinary sum for a transatlantic airline ticket, roughly equivalent to several $1,000s today. But they were not buying transportation. They were buying transformation. They were buying the experience of crossing an ocean in a flying boat, being served meals by white-jacketed stewards, sleeping in bunks, waking up over the Atlantic, and having breakfast before landing in Europe. They were buying the future. Pan Am sold the future. For decades, that was the product. If you flew Pan Am in the 1950s or 1960s, and if you are watching this, there's a real chance that you did. You remember it differently than you remember flying today. You remember it the way you remember a special occasion, because it was getting on a Pan Am flight in 1958 or 1962 or 1968 was not what getting on an airplane is today. Today you arrive at the airport 90 minutes early. You remove your shoes. You put your laptop in a bin. You eat something from a paper bag in a plastic chair by the gate. That is not what Pan Am was. Pan Am was an event. It began before you left home. You dressed for it, not because anyone told you to, because the experience demanded a certain presentation of yourself. You were about to do something extraordinary. You were going to fly across an ocean or a continent. You were going to move through the sky at speeds that your grandparents had not thought possible. The clothing was a recognition of what the moment deserved. The check-in process at a Pan Am terminal was itself a production. The Pan Am building in New York, the enormous blue and white tower that still stands over Park Avenue at 45th Street, still bearing the Pan Am name that MetLife tried to erase, had a rooftop heliport in the 1960s where you could board a helicopter for a 10-minute flight to JFK. Pan Am operated that helipad. The journey began at the top of a skyscraper. On board a Pan Am 707 in the early jet age, Pan Am was the first American airline to fly jets, ordering the Boeing 707 before it existed, essentially financing its development with the purchase contract. The experience was unlike anything that existed before or has existed since in commercial aviation. The seats were wider than they are today. The legroom was greater. The cabin was quieter, relatively speaking, because the jet engine technology that Trippe had invested in was, for its era, the quietest available. Flight attendants, Pan Am called them stewardesses, and they were selected through a process of such extraordinary rigor that acceptance into the program was considered a significant achievement. Served meals on real china with real silverware, not a packet of pretzels, not a can of soda, a meal. Hot food, prepared in a galley kitchen on the aircraft, served on trays with actual plates, sometimes multiple courses. Wine with dinner on transatlantic flights. The full experience of a fine restaurant delivered at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. The Pan Am stewardesses deserve a moment of their own recognition. By the standards of today, the selection criteria were objectionable. There were height requirements and weight requirements and appearance standards that would not survive an hour in a modern courtroom. But the women who made it through that process were, without exception, extraordinary. They were educated. Many had college degrees at a time when a college degree was not yet the baseline credential for professional employment. They were multilingual. Pan Am required its cabin crew to speak at least one foreign language. Because Pan Am flew to foreign countries and the passengers they served often didn't speak English, they were, in the fullest sense, ambassadors. Not just for their company, for their country. Because that is what Pan Am was in the 1950s and 1960s at the height of the Cold War. It was American soft power in motion. Every time a Pan Am 707 touched down at an airport in Nairobi or Bangkok or Buenos Aires or Moscow, it was demonstrating something about America that no government speech could demonstrate as effectively. America was here. America was connected. America was open for business with the world. America could put a gleaming aircraft with smiling multilingual crew members and hot meals on real china anywhere on Earth, reliably, on schedule, year after year. The State Department understood this. The CIA understood this. Juan Trippe understood it better than either of them. Pan Am was not a private airline that happened to serve American foreign policy interests. It was, in the deepest sense, a public instrument of American global engagement that happened to also operate as a private airline. Trippe cultivated his government relationships the way he cultivated his airline routes, with patience and precision and a clear view of the mutual benefit. Pan Pan Am's network, and the United States government's interests in the developing world aligned so thoroughly for so long that the line between what Trippe was building and what America was projecting into the world was almost impossible to find. In 1965, Juan Trippe made a decision that should not have been possible. He ordered 25 airplanes that did not exist yet, not 25 airplanes from an existing design, not 25 airplanes from a design that was in the final stages of development, 25 airplanes from a concept, a sketch, really, of what would become the Boeing 747, the largest commercial aircraft ever built. The wide-body era of aviation, the democratization of intercontinental travel, the story of how the 747 came to exist is inseparable from the story of Juan Trippe and Pan Am, because without Trippe's order, without Pan Am's commitment to purchase 25 of these enormous, unprecedented aircraft, Boeing almost certainly would not have built them. The economics were terrifying. Boeing President Bill Allen understood exactly how much the 747 program would cost. He understood that, if it failed, if Trippe changed his mind, if the airplane didn't work, if the market wasn't ready for an aircraft that large, Boeing would be ruined. It would be the largest corporate failure in the history of American manufacturing. Trippe and Allen met in 1965. The conversation, by the accounts of people who were present, was extraordinary in its simplicity. Two men, each of whom had built something enormous, each of whom understood the other's business as well as his own, sitting across a table and discussing a bet that would reshape commercial aviation. Allen told Trippe what the plane could do. Could carry up to 490 passengers, could fly non-stop from New York to London, could fly from Los Angeles to Tokyo, could, if everything worked as designed, reduce the cost of intercontinental air travel significantly, enough to make it accessible to people who had never been able to afford it before. Trippe heard the numbers and made the leap that defines great entrepreneurs across every industry and every era. He didn't ask whether it was possible. He asked what it would cost, and when it could be delivered. The order was placed. Boeing built the airplane. Pan Am took delivery of the first 747 in December of 1969. On January 22, 1970, Pan Am flight to departed John F. Kennedy International Airport bound for London Heathrow, 355 passengers. A crew of 18, an airplane so large that the terminal had to be modified to accommodate it. A moment so significant that the Boeing test pilots who had certified the aircraft flew to New York to watch it depart. The 747 changed everything. Trippe had predicted it would, and he was right. The cost per seat on a 747 was dramatically lower than on the 707 it supplemented. Lower costs meant lower fares. Lower fares meant new passengers, people who had never flown internationally before, who had assumed that crossing the Atlantic was something that wealthy people did, who discovered in the early 1970s that it was something they could do. The family vacation to Europe, the student backpacking trip, the business traveler who could now cross the Pacific for a price that didn't require a special budget allocation. All of this became possible because of a conversation between two men in 1965 and the bet they made together. Juan Trippe retired in 1968, the year before the 747 entered service. He had spent 41 years building Pan Am from a mail contract to Key West into the airline that connected America to the world. He handed the company to his successor and stepped back, and what he handed over was magnificent. By any measure, route network, brand recognition, fleet size, cultural significance, Pan Am in 1968 was one of the great American enterprises of the 20th century. What happened to it afterward is a story about how magnificence is not the same as invincibility. Three things happened in the 1970s that were, individually, each serious problems for Pan Am. Together, they were catastrophic. The first was the oil crisis. In October of 1973, the OPEC oil embargo began. The price of jet fuel, the single largest operating cost for any airline, quadrupled in a matter of months. For an airline the size of Pan Am, with routes across every ocean and continent, flying some of the longest and most fuel-intensive routes in commercial aviation, the cost increase was devastating. Pan Am had built its empire on the assumption that fuel was plentiful and relatively cheap. The entire economics of the 747, the whole logic of the wide-body, high-capacity, long-haul strategy, depended on fuel remaining within a range that made the per-seat economics work. When fuel quadrupled, those economics broke. Not bent, broke. The second thing was deregulation. The Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 was, in principle, exactly what its advocates said it was: liberation of the American aviation market from government price controls and route restrictions that had kept fares artificially high and competition artificially limited. What deregulation meant in practice was that every airline in America could now fly any route it wanted and charge whatever the market would bear. New carriers, lean, non-union, low-cost operations with none of the legacy costs that came with decades of operation, flooded into the most profitable markets. They didn't try to compete on Pan Am's international routes. They competed on the domestic routes that Pan Am needed to feed passengers into its international network. Here's the structural problem that deregulation exposed about Pan Am that nobody had fully appreciated before it happened. Pan Am had almost no domestic routes. It was almost entirely international. It flew from New York to London, from Los Angeles to Tokyo, from Miami to Buenos Aires, but to fly from New York to London, you needed passengers to get to New York in the first place. And Pan Am had no flights from Chicago to New York, no flights from Dallas to New York, no flights from Atlanta to New York. It depended on other airlines, competitors, to feed it passengers from the interior of the country. When deregulation came, those competitors had every reason to starve Pan Am. Why would American Airlines or United Airlines route their passengers to a Pan Am international flight when they were building their own international routes? Deregulation opened international markets too. The domestic carriers began flying transatlantic. Pan Am's most profitable routes suddenly had serious competition from carriers with better domestic feed networks and lower cost structures. The third thing was terrorism. On December 21, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 departed London, Heathrow bound for New York. Over the town of Lockerbie, Scotland, a bomb hidden in a suitcase in the forward cargo hold detonated. The aircraft broke apart at 31,000 feet. All 259 people on board died. An additional 11 people on the ground in Lockerbie died in the falling wreckage, 270 people. Many of them American college students returning home for Christmas from study programs in Europe. Young people, 21 and 22 years old, whose families were waiting for them at Kennedy Airport. Lockerbie destroyed Pan Am, not immediately, but fatally. The bombing revealed catastrophic security failures at Pan Am's London operation. A Libyan intelligence officer had managed to place a bomb aboard the flight through a security process that should have caught it. Congressional investigations, civil lawsuits, government fines, and above all, the departure of passengers who decided irrationally, understandably, that they would fly someone else. The reservations collapse after Lockerbie was immediate and severe. Passengers who had booked Pan Am flights canceled. Corporate travel managers who had preferred Pan Am for their executives switched to competitors. The brand that had represented American confidence and global reach now carried a different association. Not glamour, not aspiration, fear. You cannot run an airline on fear. And Pan Am, already weakened by the oil crisis and gutted by deregulation, could not absorb a crisis of this magnitude. The losses mounted. The debt mounted. The asset sales began. A company in financial distress does what people in financial distress do. It sells things. Pan Am's assets were extraordinary. Not just airplanes and routes, those were worth something, but they were also expensive to maintain. Pan Am owned things that airlines don't normally own. The Pan Am building in New York, the enormous blue skyscraper above Grand Central Terminal that had defined the Midtown Manhattan skyline since 1963, one of the most recognizable buildings in the world. Pan Am owned it. They sold it in 1981 to Metropolitan Life Insurance. MetLife renamed it. The Pan Am name came off the building. Another piece of the identity, gone. The Intercontinental Hotels chain. Pan Am had built it in the 1940s and 1950s to serve its passengers. You flew Pan Am to a city. You stayed at an Intercontinental Hotel. It was a complete ecosystem of American global presence. Hotels in cities where no American hotel chain had gone before. Built by Pan Am because Pan Am's passengers needed somewhere to stay, they sold Intercontinental in 1981 to Grand Metropolitan for $500 million. The money kept the airline flying for another few years. The ecosystem was gone. The Pacific routes. The crown jewel. The routes that Trippe had fought to open in the 1930s, that the China Clipper had inaugurated over the widest ocean in the world, that had given Pan Am its claim to being a truly global carrier. The routes from Los Angeles and San Francisco to Tokyo, to Hong Kong, to Sydney. In 1985, desperate for cash, Pan Am sold its Pacific routes to United Airlines for $750 million. $750 million. And gone with them was Pan Am's ability to claim that it connected America to Asia. Gone was the route network that Trippe had built with the audacity of a man who looked at the Pacific Ocean and saw a commute. United got the routes. Pan Am got the cash. The cash lasted a few years. The routes lasted forever. Each sale was presented as a strategic decision, a rationalization, a necessary step toward rebuilding Pan Am as a leaner, more focused operation. The language of corporate restructuring is always the same. You are not selling things you need. You are eliminating things that don't fit the strategy. But here is what was actually happening. Pan Am was selling the things that made it Pan Am. The building where the name meant something. The hotels that completed the experience. The routes that defined the network. With each sale, the Pan Am that remained was smaller, weaker, and less able to compete than the Pan Am that had preceded it. You cannot shrink your way to greatness. You cannot sell your identity piece by piece and expect to retain the thing that gave the pieces their value. By 1991, Pan Am had sold its transatlantic routes, the routes Trippe had opened in 1939 with the Yankee Clipper, to Delta Airlines. Delta got Frankfurt, London, Paris, Zurich. Delta got the European network. Pan Am got $1 billion and the right to continue operating a shrunken Caribbean and Latin American system. The rump that remained was not Pan Am in any meaningful sense. It was an airline that used the Pan Am name and wore the Pan Am livery and employed people who remembered what Pan Am had been. But the network that had justified the name was gone. The routes that had defined what Pan Am was, connecting America to the world, building the bridges that made the American century possible, were now operated by other carriers. The end, when it came, was swift. On December 4, 1991, Pan Am filed for bankruptcy and immediately ceased operations. No wind-down period. No transition. No careful management of the ending that 24,000 employees and millions of loyal passengers deserved. Just stop. The aircraft that were in the air that day completed their flights. Flight 436 from Barbados landed in Miami. The crew shut down the engines. And that was it. Employees learned about it from television sets. Gate agents found out while passengers were asking them questions about upcoming flights. Reservations agents were in the middle of booking tickets for future travel when the system simply stopped working. Pilots were in hotel rooms in foreign cities, scheduled to fly home the next day. Turning on the news and understanding that they were stranded. Think about what it means to have 24,000 people lose their jobs simultaneously, without warning, in a company that operated globally. A flight attendant in Frankfurt with a return trip scheduled for the following morning. A mechanic in Miami whose next shift started at 6 a.m. A reservation supervisor in Los Angeles who had 32 years with the company and had been planning to retire in 18 months. These were not anonymous workers at an anonymous company. Pan Am workers had a particular relationship with their employer that was unusual even by the standards of the airline industry, which already generates unusual loyalty. They had chosen Pan Am specifically, not just any airline. Pan Am, because it stood for something. Because working for Pan Am meant something about who you were and what you valued and where you were going. That relationship had survived the oil crisis. It had survived deregulation. It had survived Lockerbie. The workers had watched the assets sold off one by one. They had accepted pay cuts and benefit reductions and contract modifications. They had stayed. They stayed because they believed in what Pan Am was. And then one Wednesday afternoon in December, the television told them it was over. The passengers were stranded too. Tens of thousands of Pan Am ticket holders suddenly had worthless tickets. People at airports around the world with boarding passes for flights that would never depart. Honeymoon couples. Business travelers. Families coming home for Christmas. Some airlines stepped in and honored Pan Am tickets on a charitable basis. Delta, which had just purchased Pan Am's transatlantic routes, was particularly active in accommodating stranded passengers. It was a generous response to a chaotic situation, but nothing made the ending less abrupt. Nothing compensated for the absence of a proper goodbye from a company that had been part of American life for 64 years and deserved better than a bankruptcy filing and a stopped clock. Asterisk asterisk, there is a generation of Americans, your generation. The generation watching this, for whom Pan Am is not nostalgia. Is memory. Real, personal, specific memory. The first time you crossed the Atlantic. The ticket folder with the blue globe on the cover. The stewardess who brought you a warm towel before landing. The meal on a real plate somewhere over Greenland. The moment the wheels touched down at Heathrow or De Gaulle or Fiumicino, and you understood, in a way you couldn't have understood at home, how large the world was and how connected to it you suddenly felt. Pan Am gave your generation the world. Not metaphorically, literally. The routes Trippe opened, the airplanes he ordered, the fares he drove down through the logic of scale and competition. They made it possible for ordinary American families to go places that had previously been accessible only to the very wealthy or the very adventurous. The European vacation. Not a fantasy. Not something you read about. Something you did. Because Pan Am made it affordable. Because Pan Am made it safe. Because Pan Am made it feel like the most natural thing in the world to get on an airplane in New York and step off it in Rome. That gift, the democratization of global travel, the opening of the world to the American middle class, was Juan Trippe's great achievement and Pan Am's lasting contribution to American life. But Pan Am meant something beyond what it carried and where it flew. Pan Am was a proof of concept. It proved that American ambition, applied with enough intelligence and enough patience and enough willingness to take risks that most people would consider insane, could accomplish things that most people would consider impossible. A mail contract to Havana in 1927, routes across the Pacific in 1935, across the Atlantic in 1939, the 747 in 1970. Each step was the result of a specific person's decision to bet that the next step was possible. Trippe made those bets. He won them. And in winning them, he demonstrated something about America. About what America could build when it was operating at its best, that no government, program, or political speech could demonstrate as effectively. Pan Am was American optimism with an engine and a wing. When it ended, something left the American sky that has not fully returned. The airlines that fly today are competent. Some are excellent. They are safe and efficient and, on their good days, comfortable. They get you where you are going at prices that would have seemed extraordinary to Trippe's generation. But none of them is Pan Am. None of them carries what Pan Am carried. The sense that flight was not just transportation but transformation. That getting on the airplane was the beginning of becoming someone who had been somewhere, who had seen something, who understood the world in a way that grounded people simply could not. The blue globe on the tail, the Clipper class cabin, the warm towel and the china plate, and the multilingual stewardess who knew your destination and could tell you something true about it. These are not just amenities. They were a philosophy, a statement about what the experience of flying should mean. Asterisk asterisk, the question that Pan Am people have been asking for 30 years, could it have been saved? The honest answer is, maybe. With different decisions at different moments. Possibly. If Pan Am had built a domestic route network in the 1950s and 1960s, before deregulation made it so expensive to do so, it would have had the internal feed structure that its competitors used to dominate the transatlantic market. After 1978, Trippe had opportunities to acquire domestic carriers and didn't pursue them. He believed Pan Am's destiny was international. He may have been right about the destiny and wrong about the exclusivity. If the response to Lockerbie had been faster and more decisive, if Pan Am had immediately overhauled its security operations and communicated those changes aggressively to the traveling public, some portion of the passenger collapse might have been reversed. The security failures were real. The response was inadequate. If the asset sales had been more selective, if Pan Am had found a way to preserve the Pacific routes or the transatlantic network rather than selling them to fund short-term survival. The company that emerged from each crisis would have been more viable than the one that actually emerged, but these are retrospective corrections applied to decisions that were made under enormous pressure by people who were trying to save what they could in the moment they were in. It is easy to see the right path from 30 years away. It was not easy to see from inside a burning building. The deeper truth is that Pan Am's problems were structural in ways that no individual decision could fully address. The cost structure of a unionized global airline with 64 years of legacy costs was genuinely incompatible with the competitive environment that deregulation created. The route network that had been built for a regulated, protected market was genuinely vulnerable in an unregulated market. The brand equity that had been accumulated over decades, real, valuable, deeply embedded in the American consciousness, could not be converted into cash fast enough to cover the losses that the structural problems were generating. Pan Am was built for one world. It died in another. The transition between those worlds was too fast and too brutal for an institution of its size and complexity to navigate. That is not an excuse. It is an explanation, and it is a warning. Because the forces that destroyed Pan Am, deregulation, global competition, legacy costs, the inability of a large institution to change quickly enough, did not disappear when Pan Am did. They are still operating. They are still finding their targets. The next time you are at an airport, the next time you are sitting in one of those plastic chairs at a gate, eating something from a paper bag, waiting for an airline experience that bears almost no relationship to what Pan Am offered, do something for me. Look up. Not at the departures board. Not at the ceiling. Up and out, toward whatever window gives you a view of the tarmac, and the taxiways, and the aircraft moving across the concrete, and remember that 60 years ago, a man named Juan Trippe looked at the sky and saw a promise. Not a route map, not a revenue model. A promise that America could connect to the world. That ordinary Americans, not just the wealthy, not just the powerful, but ordinary men and women with ordinary jobs and ordinary savings accounts, could go to Paris and Rome and Tokyo and Buenos Aires and come home changed by what they had seen. He kept that promise for 41 years. The company he built kept it for 23 more. And then the world changed faster than the company could change with it. And the people who owned it made decisions that were each individually defensible and collectively fatal. And one December morning, 24,000 people found out from the television that the promise was over. The last Pan Am flight landed in Miami on December 4, 1991. The pilots shut down the engines. The blue globe on the tail went dark, and the sky over America got a little smaller, not because the airplanes got fewer. There are more flights today than there have ever been. More passengers, more destinations, more routes, but something that was more than a route, more than a destination, more than a flight. Something that was a statement about American possibility and American ambition and American willingness to go somewhere new and build something no one had built before. That thing ended on a Miami tarmac in December of 1991. Some of you were there for the whole story. You remember the Blue Globe. You remember the Clipper class. You remember what it felt like to board a Pan Am flight and know that you were going somewhere extraordinary, carried by an airline that treated your journey as the important thing it actually was. That memory is not small. It is not mere nostalgia. It is the record of something real. Something built by real people with real courage and real intelligence and real love for what they were doing and where they were going. Juan Trippe looked at the sky and saw the whole world up there. He was right. And we were lucky, those of us who lived in the years when Pan Am was flying, to share that sky with him.